we will look back 20 years from now and say cozy is why fantasy is the way it is today, but that doesn't mean it will be the same, because it won't. Things change. That's the underlying reason why cozy has grown, is because it's an exploration into the need for hope.
Do you love science fiction and fantasy books? You found yourself in the right dimension. Welcome to the greatest podcast in the multiverse, where each week I talk to science fiction and fantasy authors about myth, magic, and the infinite possibilities of storytelling. I'm your host, Herman Stuernagel, and I will be taking you on a journey with some of your favorite authors, helping you to get to know them and possibly uncover some new literary gems along the way. Ready to explore? Because on this show, every conversation is a doorway into a different world. So welcome once again to the greatest podcast in the multiverse. I am super excited to have with me today a very special guest. Welcome here, Andrew D. Meredith.
Thank you so much for having me, Herman.
You're very welcome, Andrew. Thank you for joining me. Andrew, why don't you kick us off and just tell our listeners who you are and a little bit about your writing journey.
Yeah. So I'm Andrew Meredith. We go by Andrew D. Meredith as my author name, because there's other Andrew Merediths that do other writing that are nothing like mine. I'm a fantasy author. I've got 6 books when this podcast comes out, and more coming. Maybe even 3 more for the rest of the year. We'll see.
Okay.
We'll see.
Very cool.
So I write primarily epic fantasy. So I have one large epic fantasy series and one Slavic fantasy, which is a little bit slower. Wouldn't say lower stakes, but a smaller area book. And then I have a new book coming out now, is Quaint Creatures, which is a cozy fantasy. So kind of a little bit all over the board.
Yeah, well, that's great.
Yeah.
So, and how long have you been publishing for?
Thrice came out at the end of 2021.
Okay, so 3 years.
So 3 years, but I've been actively writing since 2017. There's past history behind that, but 2017 is when I was the commitment to start writing to get published, and then ended up, going indie route after COVID happened. So
right. And so were you always a writer growing up and that sort of thing? Was it something that you always?
I started reading fantasy and figured I have to write this, and this is way back in the 90s, and so I wrote off and on, and then during college spent most of my classes taking notes for myself during all my classes and drawing and sketching, and then had a couple other routes I was heading down, and then tried to write I successfully wrote a book in 2010.
Okay.
Absolute garbage. And but I did it in like a month, and then had other jobs that had writing in them.
Okay.
And then didn't write until 2017 when I really, really buckled down.
Yeah, I love that. And so what was the impetus that drove that decision to really start the publishing journey for you?
Yeah, I discovered Writing Excuses podcast at that point. I had wanted to write and wasn't really willing to kill my darlings, to separate myself from my characters I had written before. Thought my original writing was just so good. I knew it wasn't, secretly deep down. And listen to Writing Excuses podcast, which always ends with, after 15 minutes, it's now you're out of excuses, now go write. But I always had the excuse of another episode, and I listened through all 12 seasons. And was kind of doing some new world building as I was learning from them. And having done that, I was out of excuses, so I had to write, and had just had a major life event occur and ended up writing 175,000 words in 6 weeks. Never written that much again that fast in my life. But I got so much out, it was like, okay, I've done it. Now I can go from there, and started heading towards, seeking traditional representation, and splitting my book up into 2, and then expanding the second one so it was a full book until and then while it was pitching, I wrote my so that was when I was writing the Collation Saga. And then needed a break and chose to challenge myself with Thrice. I had just started a new job and said, I'm just going to start without any prep. I did I think I did a month of prep over like NaNoWriMo, and then just jumped in, as opposed to years and years of prep, 20 years of preparation from the 90s on. I just got going and started writing, and wrote that over the course of that winter. And so then I had 2 books I could submit and publish, and was submitting those. And then that weird thing called COVID happened, and nobody was accepting anything at all. And and my wife, who's also an author, already had representation, and it was falling through. We were like, we've always thought about doing indie. We had done some research, but we knew it was so much work. She had a background in editing, so we knew how much work was going to have to go into it. And we're like, I don't want to do this. And then COVID happened, and we're like, well, we got time now. So we did it. And because we already had books in the docket, two different series in the docket, it allowed us, even though we then spent a year and a half preparing ourselves, we were able to go one after the other about every 6 months, until the point now that we're each publishing 2 to 4 books a year.
Okay.
Because we're constantly we have a very slow publishing process. We don't just, except for this latest book, we don't just write a book and print it.
Right.
We set it off towards betas, and then while it's off at betas, we're working on another project so that it can breathe. And so it always seems like we always have Meredith's always have a book coming out. Well, that's because we always have something that we were working on a year ago.
Yeah.
So that we have something ready, and eventually we'll catch up with ourselves. I hope it never happens, but
yeah, but I mean, that's a good way to do it. So you're not scrambling to, try to meet deadlines to get things out the door. Right. Yeah.
And it's letting us reach different entry points and audience points.
Yes.
We this last Christmas, we did several craft fairs.
Okay.
And we were the only authors. Well, there was one that had another author there, but we were basically the only authors.
Right.
And we were realizing it was important that we had all of our series out, but nobody buys the series. Not at a craft fair.
Yeah, no.
What's your first book?
You
catch a teenager, you catch a reader. They need the book ones. And so it's impressive and important to have those multiple books out, but you really need to have those book ones. And so we kind of said, okay, how can we get more book ones going so that we have more entry points, whether they're standalone or book ones? We need more entry points so that we can earn more readership, because once they read one, they may read other things.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. No, that's really cool. So have you only done the one Christmas craft fair then with your books?
We did.
Now?
We did 3 this year, and we did 1 the year before.
Okay.
We just recently moved to the area, so we've been kind of figuring what's best for us.
Okay.
I'm an extrovert, so if I could do a con every weekend, I'd be happy to. It's just a financial situation of when can you afford to do it?
Totally.
And I know that cheap. Once I do get the investment jump in, and I can do 3 or 4 big cons, they'll just start paying for themselves. Because and I know they're not huge profit margins. That's not the point. But if they pay for themselves, pay for my time, and pay for the next con, that's a huge bonus and worth it, because I love talking with people.
Right. Yeah. And especially if that is something that you enjoy doing, they can be a lot of fun. I know I've done the local Comic-Con here. And they're definitely not huge money makers, but to your point, if you can get your first book, what's happened for me, at least the one year I did, people would buy the first book, then they come back the next year. And if you have a table at the same con the next year, then they'll come back and be like, oh, I really liked your first book. Let me grab the next one or the rest
and even better if you have more books by then, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So that's worked out well for me. So I'm glad to hear. I haven't done the craft fairs yet. I feel like, especially most of my books are sci-fi. I feel like it's a little too targeted for the craft fairs. It's not. I didn't feel like it was quite the right target audience, but I'm also not an extrovert, so I don't have that easy of a time to talk to people. But at a Comic-Con,
who you're even selling to are the kids that the parents drag along.
Yes,
you see a kid who's just bored out of his mind. You're like, do you like spaceships?
Right.
Like,
yeah,
I could do spaceships. You're like, all right, come on, Mom, buy him something. He doesn't want another Christmas ornament. Buy him a book.
Yeah, right.
And there's a lot of grandmas who will be like,
okay,
if you sell them on, well, do you have a grandson? Yeah. Well, this stack of 4 books, because a grandma will buy all 4 books.
That's true.
It'd be a great Christmas present. In fact, I've already wrapped one. Here's all 4. They're wrapped up, and you hand them a whole wrapped one.
Yeah.
They'll part with their money right away, because grandson, I didn't know what to get for him. I know what to get my granddaughter, but I don't know what to get him. Great. Yeah. Fantastic. It's a great end.
It's funny. I had actually the opposite experience at the Comic-Con, because most of my customers were the parents. They'd be like the dads of the kids who's like walking around bored because they're not interested in anime and that sort of thing. That's going on at the cons, and they'd see it's okay. Well, I like science fiction. I like Star Trek. Is this? And so I could talk to the parents of some of the kids at the con. So it was a little different experience. there too. But it's a lot of fun.
Another thing would be maybe partnering up with someone else who writes something very different from you.
Yeah, right.
Like my wife writes mystery. I write fantasy. So we have people who will walk up and they'll say, well, what do you write? You both write. You're married? Oh, interesting. And I'll say, well, I write fantasy. And they'll go, oh, I don't read fantasy. And then I say, well, do you read mystery? Oh, I love mystery. And now she has an in. And then sometimes we can flip it back. And that same person will say, well, but do you have a niece or nephew who likes fantasy? Oh, yeah. Okay, I'll buy your book too. It's like, thank you. And it's easy to get offended by somebody who wants to poo-poo what you write. But often, if you are known as somebody who can make a suggestion on it, you're at a con and you say, well, okay, I get it. Sci-fi's not for you.
Yeah.
But what do you like? And you can send them down 3 tables.
Yes.
There's a high chance they'll come back by and go, you know what? He's a nice guy and he had really good suggestions. I could buy this for my X,
right.
X whatever.
Yeah.
X equals whatever. And you want to buy it for your X.
Right.
But yeah, and then they might then come back by it later in the con because you're a good guy and they want to leverage that.
Definitely. And all of a sudden they're thinking of, their friend that does like sci-fi or fantasy or whatnot and is able to. They think we'll enjoy it, right? Yeah. Love it. So tell me, Andrew, what is the why in your writing? What is the motivation behind your storytelling?
I was thinking about this, and I think the analogy I would draw to is when I was brewing beer. As I brew beer of things that I want to drink myself, but that I want people to enjoy and not just say, oh, you made this, but oh, this is good and I'm enjoying this. So I think it kind of comes down to that is I write books not to stand on a soapbox about something, but because I see a niche that I feel needs filling.
Okay.
Because I want to read it myself. And so I tell a story that I feel that I can tell. And in hopes that someone will say, this is exactly what I needed or wanted at the time.
Cool.
And that has happened where I've had people say, and I never take offense if someone says, your books are such a great palate cleanser between really dark novels. I'm like, great, read my palate cleanser.
Yeah.
You can charge directly to me. That's fine. And my goal would be to be fully sufficient, to be able to support my family just on my writing and nothing else.
Right.
We don't need a lot. So it's not, I can't wait to be the next big Brandon Sanderson.
Right.
No, I don't need to be that. I just need to have people who are happy when the bard comes to the tavern and is ready to hear the song. So,
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really cool. And I really do like that you have the dynamic with your wife, that you're able to both, fulfill that, and that you have constant books coming up between the two of you. That's a lot of fun. Yeah. So who are some of the authors who have inspired you and influenced your work?
So when I think about this, I separate people who started me off on my journey versus those who inspire me versus those who I would consider like my colleagues. And I think as the farther you go in your any career, you develop those different aspects. And I think back to as a kid, David Eddings or Dragonlance were huge influences for me. And just like everything as a kid, you have to then realize that so you can sometimes separate yourself from those, and not because they were bad or anything, but that they are what you're early on very derivative of. So how do you separate yourself from your really heavy influences, which is true in any art form?
Of course, yes.
To the point where you have people then as when you're older, you say, oh man, like Sanderson got me back into fantasy because I was kind of falling off of it and reading a lot of more historical fiction after college. And I was just kind of done. I didn't feel like there was anything new. It wasn't true, but I couldn't find it because I didn't have the right lens to look at it with. Yes. And then I found Mistborn, and that did it for me. It was like, okay, now there is something. Which he says the same of Hobb, that he was done with fantasy.
Okay.
And then he found Hobb and realized there is new. Okay, we can do this, and that's what got him done. And so Sanderson was a huge inspiration for me, but now I'm old enough and mature enough to be able to say, yeah, he's an inspiration. I don't hold him on a pedestal. There are flaws in his writing that I notice, but that's because I'm looking at it from a craft point of view. And I say, here are his flaws. They're not flaws. They're his shortcomings, his weaknesses that I can say, well, that's his niche. And what can I learn from that? I know I've got flaws. I don't know if I know what they are, but I've got them. And hopefully some other author will come along later and say, well, yeah, I like that Andrew Meredith guy, but he had this thing he always did. and broke his sentences up and put an "and" at the front of every sentence, blah, blah, blah. And but I want them to be able to take that and say, but why did he do that? Why is Brandon Sanderson such a breath of fresh air?
Right.
Why was he in 2010 and well, Elantris, I think was 2007. But the point is that over that small niche of time before he became really famous, why was he the breath of fresh air that Abercrombie was before him, that George R.R. Martin was before him? What makes them the necessary change that they became? And understanding that gives you a better way to guide yourself in your own career forward. As you say, is there something not that I need to be a bellwether that's leading the way, but what am I doing to contribute to the change I want to see?
Right. That's great. Yeah. So, and so what was it about Mistborn that was that breath of fresh air for you? If you can remember.
I think because it wasn't just a quest.
Okay.
It was a heist. And I know you even listen to early interviews. He says, because it's just like Sneakers. Like, it's nothing like Sneakers. I'm sorry. Ocean's 11 is a far better heist heist movie. And he doesn't even mention Sneakers anymore. I'm sure his marketing told him to stop saying Sneakers because nobody watches it. But everybody watches Ocean's 11. So you say, just like you say, well, it's X-Men with, or then later on you say, well, it's Avengers. Well, no, it's just the current nomenclature hero meets whatever best heist is in the nomenclature. And that's going to match because that's just comping. Yeah. But that's what it is. And so I love a good heist when they're pulled off really well. And I liked the characterization of that. And I appreciated that he was telling an orphaned queen, kind of a maiden's arc story, but it wasn't YA, even though I know it is often put in the YA group, and even though she's a young protagonist, so you can make lots of arguments for why it can be, and I will hand it to a 10 or 12-year-old without questioning it. Mm-hmm. But it's not YA. YA in the sense that it's not YA, it's, in quotes, it's not that YA, it's just not bad, it's just a thing.
Yeah.
It is, I don't know, there's just something about it that rolled out so well, in book one especially. And like anybody who's never read fantasy, it's a fantastic way to say, you never read fantasy, but you want the entertainment of the MCU.
Yeah.
Mistborn 1, it's a standalone. Wait, but isn't it part of a series? It is, but it's a standalone. If you never read another fantasy book the rest of your life, you can have said you've read Mistborn. You're now at the table, and you can chat about fantasy for the rest of your life and ignore that any of us exist after this.
Right.
You've done it. And that's really important to have those kinds of books. It doesn't mean you should be the writer of one, but maybe you are, because that's that's a great goal.
That'd be fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Cool. Well, let's talk a little bit more about your books.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit first about your epic fantasy series, because you do have a number of those out. Can you just tell me a bit of a brief overview about them and what they're about?
So first book is Deathless Beast. The series is the Collation Saga. It's an epic fantasy series, multi-point of view, a little bit of a slow burn, mostly because the pacing is just a continual clip. It's a bit of a journey story, but it's about paladins, paladames, mercenaries, a dark figure that, happens to have a cloak made of bones that makes him invisible to the gods and wants to kill them. The normal fantasy stuff. But it's about people trying to figure out their place in the world while their world is falling apart. So in the case of like the paladin main character, his order is collapsing under heresies, and his god literally asks him to become his champion. Well, how do you justify that? So it's a lot of crises of faith, or people who are not in faith at all coming to or leaving faith, and then and dealing with the trauma of that. And picking I've also described it as it's very much a story about the legacy of turning the torch over from one generation to the other. Because the old generation, the 70 and 80-year-old, 90-year-old paladins and leaders who fought in the war 70 years ago are passing away. And how do you pass off to the next legacy of what's occurring in the world? So Deathless Beast is book 1. Bone Shroud is book 2. Gloves of Eons is book 3, and that is out. And then Dread Knight is the 4th book and the end of the first arc, the first half of the series.
Okay.
And that'll be coming out the end of this summer.
Nice. Very cool.
Yeah.
And then, Yeah, I don't want to spend too much time on these books because I want to talk about your upcoming book. But so that's one of the 2 epic fantasy series that you have, correct? And so what's the second one?
Thrice is a Slavic fantasy. For fans of like Mandalorian, Lone Wolf and Cub, it's about a man and a boy on the road. Little boy has way too much magic, and everybody wants him for it because magic's supposed to kill you, and he just pours magic off of him without batting an eye. And so his adoptive father takes him on the road, and rather than running, decides to go directly into the bear's cave and just ask them to stop really nicely. And hijinks ensue, I always say. But why does the little boy have way too much magic? In book 2, Fourscored, they're stuck behind a siege, and there's a coven of wizards who want to take the magic from the little boy, and there'll be 4 books in that series, and then that arc of Needle and Leaf will be done.
Fantastic. Yeah. So what those 2 series, do they both have kind of a similar tone to them?
Thrice is a much smaller scale. I limited myself to a very small area, the size of Wales or the Crimean Peninsula. I use both those comparisons because if you look at a map, you think Crimea is way too small to have a whole fantasy inside of Crimea. But Arthur was told in all of Wales, and everywhere is 50 miles from the ocean. You can do it, and you can have mountains too, I promise. And so I wanted to really limit myself to a very small scale story that every book never leaves that little peninsula. It's all very, very small, so that I could have a little bit more control over my my travel and not have to do so much work on mapping out my routes and my moon cycles to make sure that travel 500 miles takes 2 weeks if you're a French legionnaire and all that jazz. So it's a much, much smaller one, and it's only a single point of view. The Collation Saga is multi-point of view, and but I've been able to, even though I have increased number of point of views, I've not increased my page count. I've been able to keep it right around the 150,000 word mark.
Nice.
So they're not too chunky. It's not Sanderson. It's half of Sanderson. Yeah. But it's not short either.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, obviously adding point of views always runs that risk of going well over,
Absolutely.
Right? So in there.
And you got to resolve them.
Yes. So what was it about epic fantasy that drew you to write these as your first series to put out there?
So Collation Saga is my baby from all the way back in the 90s. It was the story I thought I was going to tell, and I had to strip it all the way back down to nothing. The character, I can tell where each of the characters came from all the way back to like 1995.
Wow.
Who they were then is nothing like what they are now. I've been able to reduce any Mary Sues that were occurring. There was one really big one that I had to really change a lot of to kind of get him now. It's now he's a little sister of the main character to separate himself from me. So the character of Ralia could grow into her own before she gets her own POV in the second half of the series. Okay. But I had to do a lot of work to do that because it was so stereotypical. So that's kind of what drew me to that is I wrote that story and then couldn't let go of it. I couldn't set myself free of it. And so I did have to break it all the way down to rebuild it. And so that's kind of where my heart sat. Cool. In the case of Thrice, I really wanted to tell a Lone Wolf and Cub story of a man and the boy on the road. My little boy was 4 years old at the time.
Oh, nice.
So that was huge inspiration for that.
Yeah.
And so it just kind of poured from there by giving myself several ticker challenges of it's going to be Slavic. So it's not quite Western European. I want something different, but similar that I could work with a man and a boy on the road, with a magic system I actually had better control over with. So I set those criteria for myself so that I had something I could jumpstart really fast. And I ended up falling in love with it. Very
cool. Yeah, I love that. One more question before we move on to your new book. I just want to know about when you went to revisit your first series, had it been sitting in the desk for quite a while when you went to kind of publish it, and what was the experience like of revisiting that work that you had written so long ago?
It was rough because I went back to look at it and I knew just how bad it was. I knew I loved my characters, but I didn't even know why. So it was that was a problem for me to overcome. What ended up fixing everything was separating every single character. Okay. So instead of having these 3 characters are just going to travel around the world and things are going to happen, and just like X fantasy, right? And by separating them, it forced them into their own character arcs and growth in the writing process. And then by separating them from who they were, it allowed me to create shadow arcs of characters alongside them in their new arc. So like the Paladin as an example, in the old version was wildly chauvinistic. And me separating him, I didn't want him to be that. I needed him to be a hero.
Yeah.
And so I introduced a even more wildly chauvinistic character as a shadow who now everybody loves to absolutely just hate on Dane because he's just a terrible human being. And I know why he is that way, and I'm never going to tell anybody. But I have that now. I have a great shadow character because I basically separated the two halves of who Janid was into two and gave him a foil who could follow him around and be that problem. So doing that sort of thing just started outpouring into character arcs, and through those character arcs, I had plots to work with that just started to pre-resolve themselves as they do. Yeah.
Nice. Okay. No, that's great. I always like to, whenever I have a guest who has done that, pulled that manuscript out of the drawer, I like to ask that because I think back to what I had written in college and high school, and it would have been wildly different than the things I write now. And I maybe have something in a drawer somewhere, but I never finished a manuscript until I was almost 40. And so I don't know what that novel would have been like, but I'm sure it would have been cringeworthy.
The other thing is the chop, like not just the chop kill, but I mean the chopping up of the book. Like Deathless Beast and Bone Shroud were together my original manuscript of 175,000 words. And it was just... nobody wanted a long book from the agents, and so I was like, okay, can I split this up? And I could at the 2/3 mark. So I split off the 2/3, but I still sat on that first 2/3 for I think 3 or 4 months, and then kind of had like a fever dream of how to tie it off better at the end.
Oh, nice.
And so I did, and ended up with 150. That expanded up to about 150,000. Well, then I was left with these last 25. That was a whole third that I knew needed to be a whole novel, and so it sat for a bit, and then it started to get worked on until it was 150 as well, and was a fully fleshed its own story with its beginning, middle, and end without feeling... There is a bit of a one half and two half of it, and I've discovered a lot of my writing does end up being in dualities, where I like to write in a first part with a resolution, and then really finish it off with a second resolution. Now I've got that. Yeah, and that's what ended up happening with book 3 and 4, is book 3 is the first half of its own story, 4 is the second half, but all 4 together are 2 halves, and they resolve, and I'm going to do it again from 5 through 8. Nice. And so there's a lot of duality that happens, and opening and closing doors. So you kind of
so you kind of have these smaller arcs within the books, and then medium arcs over the course of the book, and then those arcs just kind of carry over.
Have you read K.M. Weiland's archetypal character arcs?
I haven't. Oh,
it's amazing book. It will change how you write.
Okay.
Because
I'll check it out.
So you got like the hero arc, and you have the heroine's arc.
Yeah.
Those are the stereotypical, you got this and that. And the hero's arc is what must you do to succeed? And the heroine's arc is who am I? And then coming to a resolution of that. And she's done like 17 years of podcasting, and it's kind of her dissertation on there's 6 life arcs that every character goes through if you make it to old age. And it's the maiden, the hero, the queen, the king, the crone, and the mage. And they correlate female, male all the way up, but they're not necessarily like Spider-Man is actually a heroine's arc. Right. Almost every single one. Like we just rewatched Homecoming last night. Yeah. It's a heroine's arc because it's about who am I? How do you justify the 2 halves of your whole to come to a resolution? And I use those now in their 6 to plot out tons of my arcs. And I can say, the Paladin's character is going to go from book 1 through 8 through all the life arcs. How does he do that? And there's times when your arcs are, they're going to take a break. I've resolved this character's arc. He needs to sit back for a little bit for this next book, and I'm going to give him a static arc, which can still have things happening. So this other character can go through their own arc that isn't the same arc, but it lets me do a lot more layering and flowing so that if I ever have a point where I feel there's a lull, it doesn't always mean that character needs to have a spike in their drama. I just might need to turn the knob up on somebody else to help me carry so I'm not ruining my plot, because I need this person to be sedentary for a certain amount of time, and I can use somebody else's or switch POVs to tell a better spike in the arc. And then people don't, because you're always going to have people disappointed that their favorite character is not on the page, right?
Right.
And you can't win there. So
exactly,
but you can win with the person who does like this other character. And so, and that people are going to tolerate going through characters they don't like as much to get to the ones they do. And then it's the same with you when you look at old dramas on stage, like like Shakespeare and before, is you had the zanies, which were the clowns. And the clowns would come out on the corner of the stage and do the Marx Brothers routine while a really serious, important monologue's happening. And we as readers are like, ugh, those clowns over there are ruining the story. And it's like, it's not for you. It's for those who are bored. Those who are paying attention will watch and not pay attention to the clowns. They're going to watch the important monologues, and the clowns are going to do some distraction. That's okay. That's important, and we can use that in our writing to control the energy of the book.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. I really do. Let's shift a little bit because you do have a new book either coming out or just released here, depending on when this episode goes up. But can you tell us a little bit about your new book?
Yeah, my new book is Quaint Creatures. It's a cozy fantasy about a giant who's a veterinary doctor, and he used to be a dungeon inspector, and now owns a magical pet shop, and has everything from his old schoolmaster, who's a lich, comes in. He just purchased a dungeon, and he wants Rick to come and inspect it to get accreditation for the city. And so he needs to go and make sure all of his minions are in good health, and that they have good working conditions, and hijinks ensue. But there's like a group of red caps. So it's very Legends and Lattes in that sense.
Right.
But I've really been describing it more as All Creatures Great and Small meets Pixar's Onward.
Oh, okay.
So so it isn't RPG lit, but it is. It's not an RPG lit that's taking somebody through a dungeon. It's about everything outside of that. I love writing. Okay. I love writing my characters in the margins of the big things that are happening. So if I can write a story where there's a huge siege and there's a duke over there having problems, and my characters are on a side street in the middle of a fight because that's where the magic's happening, that's the story I like to tell, because that's still going to happen. This will actually have a bigger effect on the whole kingdom, and nobody knows that it ever happened. And so I like to tell those stories. So telling the story of the guy who inspects the dungeon for the liches and makes sure that the unionized goblins aren't going to revolt is the story I want to tell. And so that's what I did.
I like it. Very cool. So this is a shift in genre from your previous works. Can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to write a cozy fantasy?
Yeah. So when Legends and Lattes came out, I read it, and it was like, yeah, I get why people like this. But I've also done a lot of reading and research since then of trying to figure out, again, the why. Why did that become, why is that big? And not, you can't really quantify why he became big. It was that cozy fantasy was going to be. It just was. Yeah. And I think it comes down to COVID, which we can get into too. But I read that, and I thought, I could probably do that. And I sat on, I mean, that was back, and he wrote it in 2020, right? Yeah. And so I sat on it for a while. I had a couple other ideas I had pitched around and played around with, and nothing ever became more than 10,000 words of me just playing around. And we were watching All Creatures Great and Small, and thought, what if there was a vet? And I was like, okay, that's a kind of a cool idea. And I thought about it for like 2 days, was all. And I was bored on a Sunday, and I said, I don't discovery write. I'm an outliner. I'll just see what happens. And then I tripped and fell and wrote 50,000 words in 4 weeks. Right. And it was done. And it was like, it never stressed me out. Usually discovery writing stresses me all the way out. And it was just like every day I got up and I wrote 2,000-3,000 words and put it in, and had a few breaks here and there for like a little bit of brainstorming. Because I usually have checkpoints in my writing where I will stop, read what I've written to reassess it before I can proceed forward, because I need to know if I've got my pacing correct. And I try to get my pacing down. I have a pretty good control over my pace, and so I want to know that I've met it, so that I will finish it in the same pace and not have to go back and fix a whole bunch of pacing issues. And so I did that, and I started it on January 21st, and I slid into home on February 21st. Nice. Barely made it. And it worked. And then I spent a month finagling it and sending it to my alpha readers to just kind of get an idea. My alpha readers I don't have a lot of them, but it's just enough for them to say, yes, it's a book. That's all I want to hear is it a book? And then I read it out loud to my wife. In this case, I finally got to read a book to my kids out loud because they're old enough now.
Yeah.
And so, okay, success. Let's go to beta. Rolled it out to beta. They got it back fast enough that my wife was able to edit it. She usually doesn't edit my work. She had time, and it's a short book. It's really short. I think Legends and Lattes, I figured, is 60,000 words.
Something like that.
This one's 52,000 words. So it's about the same size. And I have a book.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
It's funny. I've been talking to a few, cozy fantasy writers, and their experience seems to be similar in that, it just kind of flowed out of them in a way that previous books hadn't. Do you think why do you think it is that the process was so much different for you than your previous books, other than the length of it, I guess?
Probably the lack of stakes, right? Because there's less stakes. I don't need to plan out everybody's demise or survival. My character's going to live at the end. You know this. And I look at a lot of other industries and how much they're able to put out, and they're doing it without stress. So I still want to stress out over my big books. I want to, but do we need to always be stressing out? You look at like TV writing. Yeah, I know they're taking a year to put it together, but a lot of times they're writing it that week.
Yeah.
Like sitcoms and stuff.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot more crossover to what we do as novelists and what the writers' rooms do. And I know they're rooms, but they are writing books. They're writing stories because they can, and their stories still come out to 10,000 word stories for a half hour. Or Star Trek is I think a 20,000 word, it might be 10,000 words for like a Star Trek episode, but they're putting them out really fast.
Yeah,
and yeah, you can see some of it's because they're writing to rote, and I get that, but also Firefly wasn't to rote. There's episodes you're like, that was just dang good writing.
Yeah,
and it can happen, and a lot of that. So one of the best pieces of advice I got was an artist who works for a programmer who works for Cyan Studios, who did like Mist and Riven. He said amateurs wait for inspiration and professionals get up every morning and go to work. Mm-hmm. And I held on to that through college and after that, because it's true. And you can say, well, the guy who goes and designs the Coca-Cola logo is a sellout. Yeah, but he's making money.
Yes. Yeah.
I get it. Yep, he's making money. But the fact is that if you just sit around and wait for inspiration, it means your common is 0. And then you spike and you hit like a 6. Like, that's insane. That's crazy. Look at the amazing thing you did at a 6. That's great. Oh, but that guy goes to work every day. He puts out okay stuff, but it's like a 3. It's such a sellout. Ugh. Like, yeah, he's always doing 3. Now I had 6. So when he hits inspiration, he's hitting 9s.
Right.
And that's not what he's selling. It might be what he sells to Coke. It might be what he puts in a gallery. That's the magic is where the inspiration comes from. But his spike might not be a +6. His spike might be a +10 because his low is always here. And if he knows how to tap into his he's
keeping his baseline higher.
Exactly. Your baseline is higher, and it means you also have speed and you get a better ramp. And it might not be that you hit your spikes don't happen as frequently, but your low spikes are going to. So now you're always hitting 5. So that means your 5 is almost close to that amateur 6 who going from 0 to 6 all the time. Mm-hmm. So you can really get going. And so that's why it's why Brandon Sanderson could put out so much work.
Yes.
He's actually not writing that much. You look at how much we can write in a day. On a good day, you have a 3,000 word day is a great day. 5,000 would be killer. Mm-hmm. If you can be consistent on that, that's good. That's what he does every day.
Right. And that's, and that is what I'm not sure where you're at. I'm not writing full time. Right. So if I'm writing 2,000 if I could write 2,000 words on a good work day, like if I get up at 5 and can concentrate for 2 hours.
Yep.
So, if I could do that consistently every day, because that's what he talks about, 2,000 to 3,000 a day. That's his day, right? You're getting in the
365
words, right?
days of the year.
Yeah. Because on his vacation he just puts out other novels, right?
Puts more, yeah. But that means you're gonna write 100,000 words in 50 days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And people are like, oh, it would have taken me 2 years to do that. It's like, it really wouldn't. if you write, and so when people who want to write ask me, how do you do it and how can I do it? I say, set yourself a low goal, 500 words. That's my minimum.
Yeah.
If I can, because you text more than 500 words a day.
Sure. Yeah.
And if you're in a corporate environment, you're writing twice that much just in Teams. So you can write, and I know it's not inspired, but you can write 500 words a day. That's half a blog post.
Mm-hmm.
Chances are, if you write 500, you're going to write 500 more.
Yeah.
You're going to hit 1,000. And so then you start getting to the point where like, okay, I have a goal of 500. So if it's a rough day, I got 500 and it was a hard 500, worth it. I can go home happy.
Mm-hmm.
Chances are I'm likely going to write 1,000 to 1,500. Depending on what length of chapters you have, you might be finishing a whole chapter a day, great. Or you might be finishing half of a chapter, in which case by the time you get home, you're like, I got to finish this chapter. I can't let it hang.
Right.
So you finish your chapter. Now you've written 3,000 words. How did you do that? Well, because you had to. And so set yourself easy goals. It's what you do in bodybuilding. And I don't bodybuild, believe me. But in bodybuilding, you set yourself your easy goals. It's like the coaches that say, give me your 80%. People who give 80% go faster than those that give 100% because nobody knows what their 100 is. And so they give me your 100. And then the guy runs. So he runs really hard. And he says, okay, now I want you to do it again, but give me your 80%. And the guy will run faster because he thinks, I don't think I'm quite at 80 yet. I bet I can go. I'm not quite. And so then he'll say, well, you just beat your time by 3 seconds. How'd you do that? How did I do that? Well, because you were thinking about it then and trying to get to your 80. It's actually your body paces yourself better out. So set yourself low goals and you'll win.
Yeah. And I mean, there's something to be said too about consistency, right? Like, I mean, that low level consistency, if you can hit 500 words a day you're going to end up probably better off than if you set out with a goal of 3,000 words and don't hit it, right? Because then you get frustrated and discouraged the next day and you feel like you're behind and then you're anxious about getting into the chair instead of excited. And it's a whole different level of writing and getting things together, right?
And I would say too, if you go too hard for too long, it'll burn you out. Like I love it when I do it, but if I go do a writing a weekend and I do a 20,000 word weekend, I love it. I can't write for a week because I'm just done. And so don't do that to yourself unless you're willing to burn out. But if you want to be consistent, just write that low number and get going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I do want to talk a little bit more about, cozy fantasy. You touched on it a little bit, but why do you think that cozy fantasy is having its day? I know we mentioned COVID, but what, I guess, is that the only contributing factor? Do you think there are other things contributing to cozy fantasy being popular right now?
So have you heard of the, make sure I've got the actual, I pulled it up for this, the House Strauss generational theory?
I haven't. Or maybe I have, but
there's a theory and that these guys, one of them is alive now, but they basically theorized and then mapped back all the way to the 100 Years' War in England that every 80 years there are 4 turnings that occur in a society. And like you'll hear people talk about like strong men create good times create weak men create hard times create strong men. Each of those is one of the turnings that occurs, and it happens approximately every 80 to 100 years for the whole cycle, and about 20 years or so based on that. And the last one we had was World War II, was the end of the last 4th turning.
Yeah.
And so there's usually a giant crisis, and the giant crisis resolves out and goes into a golden time. We've been in the middle of this 4th turning for 20 years, and that correlates to grimdark. And if you then look back to books from 1920 to 1940, and books and stories of American Gothic and pre-Hemingway and just a lot of the Good Man is Hard to Find. It's all grimdark. It's just not fantasy yet, but that's because it was still growing as a genre.
That's right. Yeah.
Right after you get out of grimdark, you enter into Noble Dark. No, Noble Dark, and Noble Dark era was best epitomized by Tolkien. And it's the idea that, I guess you could break down like what is grimdark, and grimdark is like whether it's grim versus noble. Is grim is how much agency somebody has.
Right. Okay.
Versus bright and versus dark is whether good will win or whether evil might win. It's a high likelihood.
Yeah.
And so in the case of like Tolkien, Noble Dark is there's a lot of agency. I mean, Theoden gets to choose to ride to his death. There's choice.
Right.
But Sauron won. He only lost because of the Eucatastrophe. Because Frodo lost. And the Eucatastrophe cast the ring in its own fall down into the Mount Doom. Spoiler alert. So that's Noble Dark, but that brings us towards Noble Bright, and we would theoretically be heading back into our next Noble Bright era in 2040, so 20 years from now. And you can look backwards to the last Noble Bright era, which would be 1960 to 1980, and that would be Star Trek and Pern and all of the kind of bright fantasy. And so what I think I'm seeing happen is that as you head towards Noble Bright, people have been only soaked in Grimdark. And so they're like, well, what's Noble Bright? Ew, that's so saccharine. Well, because that's also why Grimdark was written, was because in reaction to the saccharine-ness of, well, what's all with all this hope? Ugh, this is...
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening is that we don't know what Noble Bright will look like in 2040, but we are starting to explore it. And because all four of the last one's Grimbright.
Okay.
That would be like Wheel of Time and stuff. And
okay.
But they all exist all the time. It's just a matter of who's on the throne at the
Preference.
time.
Yeah.
And the opposite is kind of antithesis to what people are want to consume. But as you head out, you start to hit an equilibrium where people are like, oh, I think I kind of like that. And so I think that's what happened with Cozy is it is a, I've seen arguments saying it's actually Grimbright. I disagree. I think it really is Noble Bright, or it's the exploration of Noble Bright. And we will look back 20 years from now and say Cozy is why fantasy is the way it is today. But that doesn't mean it will be the same, because it won't. Things change.
Yeah.
So that's why I think that's the underlying reason why Cozy has grown, is because it's an exploration into the need for hope.
Yeah. I that's fascinating. I have definitely heard that theory before, not in relation to literature, just in relation to current events and that sort of thing. But I've definitely heard that, and explored the idea that Cozy is kind of the reaction to Grimdark, right? People got tired of everything being grim and dark and wanted something a little happier to read. But I like that analysis, and it makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
I always everything I do, I try to think in terms of, I'm not trying to make a wave, but how can you control the wave? Is that I don't want all fantasy to be all Cozy all the time.
No.
However, I do want an aperitif.
Yes.
I do want to go out for steaks one night and then go out for Indian food, like we were talking about earlier, another night. It's a totally different thing. I want flavor. I don't want the same all the time.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
But every peak, whoever's on the throne does kind of create the all the time. Sanderson is almost quintessentially Noble Dark. And so when people are saying, well, it's really Sanderson, there's so much Sanderson, everything's Sandersonian. It's like, no, everything's Noble Dark. Just Sanderson happens to be the guiding hand that's kind of telling authors, here's what it is. It is our job as authors to take that and say, okay, Sanderson, but. And then the person after Sanderson will be able to say, oh, that's the but. That's a great but. Not, one T. But and then we will look back, and we'll be able to look back as historians and say, okay, Sanderson begat so-and-so who begat so-and-so and moved on to who's on the throne, because there are. Yeah. And, well, you're always talking about Tolkien. Why don't you talk about other authors of his time? Got it. He did inspire all these other authors to do their thing.
Right. But
how they took the torch is the important thing.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I think, so do you see Sanderson's influence, I don't want to say waning, because he's so prolific, but do you see that sort of influence changing, or do you see him changing the tide himself, whereas he's moved towards some cozier works like Tress in the Emerald Sea and some of his secret projects that have been a little cozier than his other series.
I don't know the guy, but I believe he wrote these as a personal reset, not just to kill time, not just as a gift to his wife, which two of them were, but as a reset. I think he was burning out in his creativity, whether he would prefer to admit it or not. And he can still put out words. So it's not like he couldn't put out words, but was his creativity waning after Stormlight 4? I would probably argue maybe it was. And there were some things that he was kind of losing sight of the goal. Book 5 will tell. I'm really looking forward to Stormlight 5 and seeing, he's back. He's back for good. We can keep going. Because he's somebody who can't stand to sit still or be creative or do something new. Other authors are happy to do the same thing till they die. That's fine. That's on them. But the type of creativity that Sanderson has, he wants new. And so he wrote something 4 completely bonkers books because they're fun things for him. And it gave him, hopefully, it also, who knows what kind of inspiration that had on Cozy, right?
Yeah.
But that's also part of the whole psyche of Civilization too, is that he was writing that, but so was Travis Baldree. And he wrote Legends and Lattes before Sanderson announced his secret projects.
Yeah.
They both did cozy projects. Ergo, something's important there and something's happening that's shifting. I think Baldree I think he wrote it in 2020, or did he write it in 2019 and then published in 2020?
It was, I think he wrote it, if I remember correctly, and I mean, definitely nobody quote me on this. I believe he wrote it for NaNoWriMo in 2019.
Okay, so before COVID.
And then it came out in 2020, and that's why it came out, during the COVID for initial lockdowns. That's how I remember it. I might not be correct, but
which means he was a happy accident.
Yeah.
And I don't think he's necessarily the reason people wrote Cozy. I think it's part of it. It was a contributing factor. But what I've noticed, having joined the indie scene in 2021, is when I kind of jumped back in. I got out of social media for a year and then came back in. And when you look at, you can use SBFBO as a good marker for that. But if you look at SBFBO and the books that were coming out in 2021 and 2022, they were very dark. And it was in reaction to the violence of 2020 and people and just using it as a balm. I always forget the word, but the word you use when you, not wish fulfillment, but something that anger as a means of healing.
Yeah. Right.
And so that was a lot of the writers who were doing that were really into that. And that's fine because that was part of the reaction. And then immediately after that in 2022 and 2023 was the Cozy explosion. And maybe we'll call it the Stuffy explosion because it just poof everywhere, fluff everywhere. Because then the introverts started talking and saying, actually, I kind of like this sitting at home and doing nothing. What about sitting in front of a fire and just writing a book about sitting in front of a fire? People going to read that? Says, yes, they are. And so that was the other half of the reaction to COVID was give me calm moments of Japanese and just Studio Ghibli vibes. And because Studio Ghibli's been around since 89? Even before that, if you track back to the fact that Miyazaki worked on Gollum for the Lord of the Rings cartoon. Okay. And so you could theoretically say that the Baz Rankin Bass is a Ghibli film. But that's Cozy. I mean, I didn't grow up on a lot of anime, but David the Gnome, which is anime, was a huge inspiration for me as a little kid. Okay. And it's so Cozy's always been around.
Yeah.
It just was needed.
Yeah. And I've heard Travis speak about that as well when people have talked to him about it. And he's like, it's not like he invented Cozy. I mean, you got, Terry Pratchett was Cozy. There's, The Hobbit is really cozy. In a lot of ways. So it's not like he invented it, but as to what you were saying before, Legends and Lattes came out at a time, I think, where people needed just a breath of fresh air amongst everything that was going on. We saw the same thing during COVID with Animal Crossing coming out on, the research. Animal Crossing wasn't new. I mean, Animal Crossing's been around for 20 years, but it got a surge of popularity through COVID, right? Because it was you're not running around having to slay orcs. You're, talking to your
killing
friends.
6 hours. Absolutely. I think that's also why I couldn't write this book until now either, is I didn't want to be just another voice rehashing, because every book that comes out that's famous is going to have 100 new books that are written that are just like it. And I didn't want it to be that. So I think that's also why I killed several projects, was because I wasn't ready for the story I was going to tell until I had the one I knew I could tell and tell in my own way, in my own pacing.
Yeah. That's cool. That is cool. So did you face any challenges shifting to a cozier tale?
Yeah. There were a couple chapters where I felt it was just going to be as boring as heck. And I had to remind myself, no, this is what you're after. You'll fix it later. And that's what I have to tell myself with every book. If there's ever a point where I'm like, nothing is happening, often I'll find out there actually is something happening. I'm just frustrated that I don't know the resolution to it yet. And so it's kind of the reader's frustration. Okay. And so I just had to power through. And so this one was a marathon for me that I knew I could not stop. And, the fact is, you cannot edit a blank page, and every first draft is garbage. So you got to finish the draft. You can't go back and fix it while you're going. Sometimes, except when I go back and read portions, just make sure I've got the flow correctly. But even if I read through that and like, this is going to need a lot of work, I'll just leave a note for myself. Fix it later. You don't need to worry about it right now, because you don't know where this is going. Finish the dang book, and then you can fix it. So I faced a lot of that several times where I was just like, I don't know. This is boring. So I'll finish this chapter and write the next one. Next one's exciting. And then it turns out that the thing I said in the boring chapter was actually a seed for an adventure for later. And so it all works out. Yeah. So that was a huge challenge.
Did you find yourself having to scale back the stakes at all? Having been used to writing higher stakes books, like did you have to intentionally scale things back?
Yeah, there were a few like battle moments where I resolved them too quickly. Like I just kind of closed the curtain and ended the scene, and then in hindsight realized that was actually the best thing I could do. So a lot of the battles kind of cliffhang and then pick up 5 minutes later, and then it helps keep that cozy. Like it's not about the fight. Yes, there's a fight. Yes, you know who this character is, but it's not about the fight. So we're gonna head towards the big event and then talk about what happened afterwards, because I'm not here to show you how they're going to spend 3 chapters fighting a fire or fighting a breakout of red caps. But I am going to show the red caps and they're dangerous, and then show that, yes, it was resolved, because it's not about that. It's about why are the red caps there. So playing a little bit more with the mystery dial rather than with the violence dial, because I also wanted the book to be not just cozy, but wildly approachable for all ages, so that I don't want anybody to be able to say, well, I can't have my child reading that. Like, yeah, you can. And you can read it too. It's written for you. It's written for them, which are most of my books. I write clean fantasy that I can hand to a parent and a child at a con and say, you can both read this.
Nice.
Because that's what we did in the 80s and 90s, right? Your dad or your mom read a book and said, it's your turn, you're reading this. Or, oh, no, you ain't reading that one. And they put that one away on the shelf. And then when you're 16, you go sneak downstairs and read it. But that's how it works. There was no YA. There was only what your parents told you could read. And and that's what I want to offer is the shared experience of a book that a father and a daughter, or a mother and a son can read together and have something to talk about from now. And then when they stop talking in high school, to talk after high school about it too.
Right. Yeah. I like that. I don't know where I would have been as a fantasy reader or a writer if I wasn't allowed to read The Sword of Shannara when I was 13. Right. Is it clean fantasy? Right. It wasn't. Not a YA novel. YA wasn't a thing back then, like to your point. But I do appreciate that. I think that's really important for future readers, future writers.
It is. Yeah. That's what we need to. That's what we need to develop.
Really cool. Now, can you tell us a little bit more about the world of Quaint Creatures? And you've told us a bit about the story, but what's the world like that they're in?
Yeah. So it's kind of my take on a disc world. But it's not a disc, but it's my weird world. It's called the Sideways, because there used to be 2 worlds, the Hereways and the Thereways. The Hereways may or may not have been our world sometime in the distant past, and the Sideways was the Fey world that was then discovered and magic started to happen as the different worlds traded alongside each other. And then they went to war, and the worlds ended up collapsing in what's called the Vorpaling. And basically the two worlds sort of kind of collapsed on each other, and one of them became a spirit death world, and one of them became a super verdant death world. And in the middle, in the Venn diagram between the two, is the sideways, where things can live and not worry, and it's kind of normal, but it's also where both places came. And so all the races that exist, from elves, giants, dwarves, all came from different parts of the two and exist now in the middle. And then the Vorpaling created a whole bunch of anthropomorphics from deaths that occurred during the big cataclysm, and their souls jumped into animals and made them anthropomorphic. So it was kind of my answer to kind of skimming trademark and making sure I didn't have, I know hobgoblin itself is not trademarked, but it could be. And you can't say hobbit, so you say halfling. And so I took out halflings and replaced them with like the brownies, which are like, you know, the Scottish or British redcaps. So I have tiny little halflings, which are brownies. And then rather than hobgoblins, well, my daughter likes red pandas, and I like red pandas too. So what's better than a really cute red panda that can kick your butt with a sword? Those are my hobgoblins. So I was able to play with a lot of fun tropes, and also subverting, kind of like with Zootopia, you know, subvert the fact that you got a rabbit that does not like to be called cute, even though she is. I can play with those kinds of jokes and make a lot of those references.
Right.
So that's where the Sideways came from. It's tons of little races that all exist within the Sideways. With a little, you can travel out to the Hereways and Thereways, but it's not advisable.
Okay, that sounds really cool and really intricate for a short standalone cozy novel. Did you?
Yeah, exactly.
Did the world kind of develop as you were telling a story, or did you have a sense of this world before you started?
Yeah. I wrote for a weekend, and then my wife said, "Well, could I write in that too?" And I said, "Yeah, why not? We can write in that." She's got something on the burner for that.
Nice.
And so we sat down for a whole day with the kids away, and for the first time got to make a world together and just brainstormed. Nice. Had some things that we have since then had to pull back. Like originally, all of the Vorpal, the anthropomorphic Vorpals, all had Welsh names, and not everybody likes to try to pronounce Welsh like we do. And so I had to downplay that. So it was a lot of fun to get to do really expansive world building, which I'm known for, and then tie it down to something that's going to be wildly approachable for all audiences.
Right. That sounds like so much fun. Yeah, that sounds like it was such a fun process to put that together. I really love that. Tell me about the main character as well. So a giant who wants to be a veterinarian. What is that all about?
So Rick and his wife Evelyn. And the fact that his best friend's a lich, I only realized in post that it's Rick and Evie from The Mummy, which is one of my favorite movies. And their best friend's a mummy. But so Rick is a giant, and Evelyn is an elf. And the giants are more like a furbolg, so they're only 9 feet tall, so they're not that tall. And so his wife Evelyn is an elf warlock of justice, centuries older than him. And he went to veterinary college, and she worked as not a dungeon inspector, but as a torchbearer. So someone who would go as an NPC and make sure that the adventurers are not skimping on what they're paying dues to the union, and make sure that they're handling their inventory well. So she would do that sort of thing, like as a GM, basically.
Okay.
And they met on site at a dungeon. He was inspecting, and she was watching a group, and they walked in, and the animal the door was supposed to be locked, and the salamander he was inspecting ended up torching the whole group. And he fell in love with her at first sight. And so since then, he was fired from the dungeon inspection organization because he whistle blew on some animals that were being smuggled and moved between dungeons illegally. And so he whistle blew, ended up getting fired. And so they bought a gnome craftsman house, a gnome craft house that it's an endless hall house that they can now use as storage for all the animals that they've rescued from dungeons that were mistreating their animals.
Cool.
And then rehome them if they are so inclined. So
that's really cool. So how did that come about? Like, how did I know you talked a little bit about All Creatures Great and Small, but how did that story really develop for you?
Yeah. Have you ever played the board game Dungeon Lords?
I haven't. No.
There's a game called Dungeon Lords and a game called Dungeon Pets, and I played the second one. Dungeon Pets is you're the imps that are raising the monsters to sell to the Dungeon Lords, so the Dungeon Lords can buy their animals for their dungeons.
Yeah.
And lots of hijinks, and your imps getting gnashed into bits by the monsters, and and it's just super zany art, and so that was a huge inspiration because it was like, where's the book about the economy of dungeons that isn't just the true, like, the nitty gritty economy, but the silly economy, like what happens when you need a teleporter fixed? Who fixes that? Does the dungeon lord have to do it himself, or does he have to call a dungeon a portal repairman? Right. How do you get one out there if you're in the middle of nowhere? And so it was just a lot of those stupid questions that we all think about when we're playing D&D, and we're like, well, why are there hobgoblins here? We're underwater. Okay, well, let's talk about that. And the dungeon master is like, I don't know, it's just what's in the book, just forget about it. Or the dungeon master goes, well, let me tell you. And that's where a lot of the fun lies when you're playing D&D, is all of the stuff when you're not actually adventuring, just talking about the world. Right. And so I wanted to do a bit of that, and I love world building my animals. So in the case of like Collation Saga, I replaced all normal animals with mythological. So there are no cats, there's manticores, there's no dogs, there's infalls, there's no birds, there's griffins, there's no monkeys, there's flying monkeys. How do I look in the medieval, Monsternomicon and say, how can I replace every animal with something from myth or legend?
Yeah.
And so I already had practice in that. And so in this case, I was like, okay, how can I show a beholder without crossing trademark law? Okay, I'm going to reinvent the beholder. And so I can play with all these monsters that I want to have fun with, and taking it from a point of view of, okay, I need something that's going to have an eye infection. Okay, it needs to be a beholder. So I'm going to have a beholder. Let's reinvent the beholder so I can have an eye infection that needs to be dealt with. And so then I can kind of plot in a little bit of solutions here and solutions there. I did a call out to friends saying, what should I put in this? And Kay from Kay's Hidden Shelf said, how about a red panda with an allergy, and every time she sneezes, she teleports. I'm like, that's a plot point. Yeah. And so I built a whole plot point based on the fact that the red panda
so much fun.
Has an allergy. Yeah.
That's so much fun.
So a lot of it's just throwing it at the wall and see what sticks. And then from there, seeing how you can resolve it. I read a lot of P.G. Woodhouse, and he does a lot of, J.C.M. Byrne does the same sort of plotting, where he piles things on to the point where you're like, okay, you can't resolve this now. It's too much. And then you put one more thing in. How are you going to resolve it? And it turns out either that thing or something two back was actually the solution, and everything tumbles to a solution in a way that makes you go, oh, I see what you did there. Right. And so I was trying to do a lot with that. And that was a challenge in this book, is how can I do kind of bracketed programming of, okay, I'm going to layer something else on, layer something else on, layer something else on. Can I resolve it all in one swoop, or do I need to resolve one after the other back to zero so I can come back to where I started and leave satisfied?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I imagine that must have been a challenge in a short book. You don't have the space of an epic fantasy 8-book series to tie up those loose ends. You're trying to tie up those layers, within, a few hundred words or a few hundred pages. Yeah. I mean,
one of the best ways I found to do that is to know what your beats are. Like I write in approximately 1,000-word beats. But 1,000 words. So I write a bullet point. I know that bullet point, one sentence, can be something I can write in about 1,000 words. And then I say, this book, I want to be an epic fantasy. So I want it to be long chapters. So it's going to be 35 to 5,000 words chapters. So I know it's a 3-beat or 5-beat chapter. And then I can have a goal to go after, and that will let me can control how long it's going to be, as opposed to having something bloat out to first book's 70,000, the last book's 300,000. Come on now. How can you break that up? And as indie, we get to do that. We get to say, well, yes, I could have made this a huge fat book, but I can give you 3 books. How about that? Oh, thank you. And then it's also a good financial decision too, because you actually will make more off of 3 books over time, because you get more per book without breaking anybody's bank. Nobody's upset about it, versus your big fat book that actually breaks your bank.
Yes.
But the same for short. The same I did with Thrice. Thrice is 2,500 words. In this case, these were 1,500 words. So I said, okay, I need my bullets to be slightly smaller stakes. So we'll say it's about 500 words per bullet. I'm still going to get 1 to 3 bullets per chapter, and I can just resolve things. And then every chapter feels like it's done its thing. Maybe every 2 chapters feels like a plot point, a big plot point. Okay. And that way I can say, okay, 50,000 words is my goal. Now that I've done a 50,000 word book, I didn't quite like how short the audiobook was. It was just shy of 5 hours.
Okay.
So I will probably, any other books I write in the Sideways will be just 55 to 60,000 words just to push it over the 5 hour mark.
Right. Okay.
So if you know your writing style and how well you as a writer can pace yourself, you have better control over how long your books are, and you're more likely to hit the goal that you've set for yourself.
Yeah.
I know JCM Byrne has really tight goals too. He says it will be 165 and it ends up being 164. And so he's able to keep his word counts really tight as well.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that is just getting to know your own process and your own your own writing. You've got to have a few books. I mean, for me,
yep.
I can't do that. I shouldn't say I can't do that. I don't do that. But
that's right. There's no wrong way to write. There's just your way to write.
Yeah, I set an intention to write 50,000 words, and it ends up being 85,000. So I mean, it's just I'm a plancer, I call it. I try to outline, but I don't really stick to it. But I need some guideposts at least to get me where I'm going, or I go off the rails. But sometimes I still go off the rails, and it all works out.
Yeah, exactly. That's fun.
Yeah. I don't want to keep you here too long because I know you have another recording coming up tonight. But I do want to give you a chance to talk about your new YouTube show and what that's all about. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my wife and I have started a new late night chat, kind of Graham Norton style chat on Monday nights because nobody's doing anything Monday nights, and we figured why not. So it's a little late for the East Coast, but we're not all on the East Coast. So
right.
It's at 9:00 on Monday nights at P Meredith author is the YouTube location. That'll be in the show notes, I assume.
Yes,
but it's every night at 9. We'll interview somebody. It's never more than an hour, and we just kind of relax. We try to ask questions that maybe we know that person doesn't normally get, so that they aren't just having to rehash the same things they do in a lot of interviews, as we all do, and I love that. But not everybody likes doing that. So we try to watch a few interviews and try to figure out something else we can do to figure out. We're not really getting into the nitty gritty on what their process is, but maybe a little bit more of who they are, so it has more of that Graham Norton feel. And then if people watch it on the replay, they still get a fun something to watch in the middle of the week until Thursday, Friday, Saturday when all the booktubes go up.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yes. No. It's been a good chat so far. How many episodes have you had so far?
By the time this one goes up, we'll probably be at 5. So we just started it, but my wife's been doing interviews and I've been on interviews. So it's nothing new for us. And we've been able to leverage, all the friends we've made over the community to get people who want to come in on an interview, anywhere from authors to audiobook narrators to bookstore owners, all across genres, from fantasy, mystery, you name it, we've had and will be having. We've got it scheduled out for quite a while and lots more to come.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. Our listeners should go and check that out in the show notes because it is a lot of fun. So, Andrew, this is the greatest podcast in the multiverse. Can you tell me about how, in a parallel universe, a different choice might have shaped another version of your life?
Yeah, there's a couple branches I could go down because in college, wanted to be a miniature modeler.
Oh.
And then a comic book artist. Mm-hmm. And then I was a game designer, a board game designer for several years. So if we went down the game designer route further, then the manager that fired me as a scapegoat over his budgetary issues would have been fired, and I would have become a lead designer at the company I was with, and probably still designing story-driven, narrative-driven board games to this day.
Wow. So you still in the storytelling realm.
I am. Yep.
But
and I'm still kind of board gaming on the side. I've never stopped thinking about it, and I have some plans. So the multiverses will align.
Nice. Something to watch for.
That's right.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me. This was a great chat. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having
me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Can you just tell our listeners where they can find you and how they can get copies of your books?
Yes, I am across all social medias under Andrew D MTH. So if you think of Andrew D to the nth power, you can find me everywhere. And my books are available everywhere books are sold. Ebooks are only on KU right now because we're trying that out. But you can find my ebooks on KU. You can buy our print books and directly from us at games-afoot.square.site. But they're available everywhere. And we always release our audiobooks with our books. They come out at the same time. So they're available in all prints and formats.
Love it. Very cool. Well, thank you once again. I will make sure to link all of those in the show notes. And it was great to have you.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Herman.
All right. Take care.